Story 1. The Abandoned Pet. When my fiancé Jake and I moved into our first home together, we were buzzing with excitement. It was a modest two-bedroom place on the edge of town, with a front porch that creaked under your weight and a backyard that stretched into a patch of woods. It wasn't perfect, peeling paint, a couple of drafty windows, but it was ours. We'd spent the whole day unpacking, blasting music from my old Bluetooth speaker while figuring out where to place our mismatched furniture. By the time night fell, we were exhausted, sprawled on the couch with takeout containers and a bottle of cheap wine. That's when we first heard it, a low, scratchy whine at the front door. At first, I thought it was the wind. Jake joked that it was probably a raccoon looking for leftovers. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like something, or someone, was determined to be let in. I cracked the door open cautiously, half expecting to see a neighbor or worse, a wild animal. Instead, there he was, a skinny, shivering dog with fur the color of ash and eyes that glowed yellow under the porch light. He didn't bark or wag his tail. He just stared up at me, unblinking, as though he had been waiting. "Oh my God, Jake, look at him," I whispered, my heart aching for the poor creature. Against Jake's grumbles about responsibility, we decided to take him in for the night. After all, what else could we do? He looked like he didn't have a friend in the world. We named him Ash because of his fur, but something about him felt off, even from the beginning. When we brought him inside, he didn't act like any stray dog I'd ever seen. He didn't sniff around or wag his tail at the warmth of the house. Instead, he sat perfectly still in the living room, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Jake tried offering him some leftover chicken from our takeout, but Ash didn't touch it. He just kept looking at us. No, not at us, through us. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as the behavior of a traumatized stray, but Jake was clearly unnerved. "Dogs don't act like this," he muttered under his breath. I told him we'd take Ash to a vet the next morning, but in the back of my mind, I felt a sliver of unease. That night I couldn't sleep. Jake passed out immediately, but I kept hearing faint noises from the living room, like claws scraping against wood. I told myself it was Ash adjusting to his new surroundings, but the sound was relentless. Finally, I grabbed my phone for light and crept down the hallway, my socks muffling my footsteps. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of a street lamp outside, and there he was, sitting in the exact same spot we'd left him, staring directly at the front door. His posture was rigid, his ears perked as if he was waiting for someone, or something. "Ash?" I whispered. He didn't even flinch. That's when I noticed the faint but unmistakable outline of muddy footprints leading from the door to where he sat, and they didn't look like paw prints. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The prints were large, human-like, but uneven, like whoever had made them was dragging their feet. They were damp, glistening faintly under the dim light, as if they'd been left only minutes ago. My first instinct was to check the door. It was locked, the deadbolt secure, exactly how we'd left it. Ash's eyes stayed glued to the door, unblinking, his body so still he could have been a statue. I wanted to wake Jake, but something stopped me, some gut feeling that told me whatever was happening, it wasn't something Jake could fix. Slowly, I backed out of the room, my pulse pounding in my ears, and retreated to the bedroom. I locked the door behind me and crawled into bed, my eyes glued to the shadows under the crack of the door. The next morning, the footprints were gone. I felt a rush of relief, thinking maybe I'd imagined them in my sleep-deprived state. Jake wasn't thrilled when I told him what had happened, but he chalked it up to my overactive imagination. "Maybe you're just freaked out from moving," he said, ruffling my hair. Ash, meanwhile, seemed different. He was still quiet, still unnervingly still, but now he followed me everywhere I went. If I walked into the kitchen, he'd appear a few seconds later, standing silently in the doorway. If I sat on the couch, he'd settle a few feet away, always watching. His eyes weren't the warm, friendly kind you'd expect from a dog. They were sharp, almost calculating, like he was observing me, studying me. Jake noticed it too, but every time I brought it up, he shrugged it off. Dogs are weird, he'd say, though I could see the unease in his face. By the third day, Ash's presence started to feel oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the house seemed heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. I tried taking him outside to see if he needed to run around or burn off energy, but the moment I opened the back door, he refused to step out. He planted his paws firmly on the threshold and let out a low, guttural growl, not at me but at the trees in the backyard. His hackles rose, and his glowing yellow eyes seemed to pierce through the dense forest, locking onto something I couldn't see. I stood there, the cool breeze chilling my skin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from those woods. Ash eventually turned and walked back inside, his growl fading, but the sense of being watched stayed with me. That night, things escalated. Jake and I were in bed when we heard a loud thud from the living room, followed by a dragging sound. My stomach dropped. Jake grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed, his face pale but determined, and motioned for me to stay put. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll check it out." My heart raced as I listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway. I wanted to call out to tell him to wait, but my throat felt dry and fear had rooted me in place. Minutes passed and then I heard him shout, "What the hell?" I bolted out of bed, ignoring his warning, and found him standing in the living room staring at the front door. Ash was there too, sitting motionless as always, but the door, our locked deadbolt door, was wide open. The cold night air seeped into the house and my skin prickled with goosebumps. Jake's grip on the bat tightened as he stepped cautiously toward the open door, peering out into the dark. "I locked this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I know I locked it." Ash remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the doorway. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the porch, a shadow slipping into the darkness of the yard, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. Jake slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt back into place. "Maybe it was the wind," he offered weakly, though we both knew that didn't explain the footprints or the strange behavior of the dog. I wanted to suggest leaving, just grabbing our stuff and going to a motel, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't even know how to explain what I felt, like the house itself wouldn't let us leave. Later that night, I woke up to a strange sound, soft at first like whispering but growing louder and more distinct. It was coming from the living room again. I nudged Jake awake and we both lay there in silence, listening. The sound wasn't quite human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It was a rasping, wet noise like someone struggling to speak through a throat full of water. Jake grabbed the bat again, his face a mask of grim determination, and motioned for me to follow. We crept into the hallway, our feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. When we reached the living room, the sound stopped abruptly. Ash was sitting in the middle of the room, his back to us, his head tilted in that same eerie way as if listening. Then slowly he turned to look at us, and for the first time since he arrived, he bared his teeth in a silent snarl. Ash's teeth glinted unnaturally in the dim light, and his yellow eyes seemed to burn brighter, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Jake took a step forward, raising the bat, but Ash didn't move. Instead, his snarl faded, and his expression shifted into something even more unnerving, calm, almost knowing. It was like he understood exactly what we were thinking, what we were feeling, and he was daring us to act. Jake hesitated, lowering the bat slightly, and that's when we noticed the faint sound again. The whispering. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from the walls. My chest tightened as the noise grew louder, surrounding us, filling the room with a low, guttural murmur that seemed to vibrate in my skull. Ash turned his head slowly toward the corner of the room, his body tense like a coiled spring. Jake followed Ash's gaze and his face turned ashen. In the corner, where the faint glow of the street lamp barely reached, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, writhing and twisting like smoke caught in a draft. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes and impossibly long limbs, but when I blinked, it was gone. Did you see that? Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't bring myself to answer. My hands were trembling and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. Ash let out a low, rumbling growl, his fur bristling as he took a single step toward the corner. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you hyper-aware of your own breathing. Then, with deliberate slowness, Ash turned back to us, his eyes seeming to say, "Leave now." We didn't need to be told twice. Jake grabbed my hand and we bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us. My chest was heaving, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what we had just seen. Jake paced the room, the bat still clutched in his hand, muttering under his breath. "This isn't normal. None of this is normal," he kept saying. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to think of what to do. Call the police? And tell them what? That our dog and some shadows were freaking us out? The thought was absurd, but staying in the house felt even worse. I finally looked up at Jake and whispered, "We need to leave." He nodded, his face pale but resolute. "At first light," he said. "I'm not walking into those woods at night." We didn't sleep. Every creak of the house made us jump, every gust of wind felt like a warning. Ash didn't scratch at the door or make any sound, but somehow that was worse. The silence felt oppressive, unnatural, like the house was holding its breath. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Jake and I grabbed whatever we could fit into a bag and headed for the car. I half expected Ash to block our path, but he was nowhere to be seen. The living room was empty, the front door locked as we had left it. I felt a strange pang of guilt leaving him behind, but deep down, I knew he wasn't just a dog. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us leave, that its presence lingered in the rearview mirror long after we turned the corner. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, pulling into a diner parking lot to catch our breath. The relief of being out of the house was palpable, but neither of us spoke for a long time. Jake kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see Ash or something worse following us. I stared at my phone, trying to decide whether to call someone, anyone, but I didn't even know what to say. Eventually, Jake broke the silence. "That dog," he said, his voice trembling. "It wasn't just left there. Someone put it there. Like a warning or a guard." I wanted to argue, to say he was being ridiculous, but deep down, I knew he was right. There was no other explanation for the way Ash acted, or the things we'd seen. But a guard against what? And why us? We never went back to that house. I called the landlord and made up some excuse about a family emergency, leaving our deposit behind without a second thought. A few weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I decided to dig into the house's history. What I found still gives me chills. Over the past decade, there had been 3 other tenants, all of whom had broken their leases early and left without explanation. One report mentioned an animal control officer being called to retrieve a stray dog found sitting on the front porch. A dog described as thin, ash-colored, with glowing yellow eyes. I haven't been able to stop thinking about Ash since then. I still don't know if he was there to protect us or to warn us about something darker. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear scratching at the door and I'm terrified to ever look outside. Story 2. The Phantom Roommate. I moved into the apartment at the start of my sophomore year. It wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old building a couple blocks from campus. But it was cheap and close enough that I could sleep in before morning classes. At the time, I was juggling a full schedule, a part-time job at the bookstore, and trying to make new friends after a rough freshman year. The apartment was supposed to be my little sanctuary, a place where I could finally have some privacy. No more sharing with random roommates who left their dirty dishes piled high or blasted music at 2 a.m. For the first few weeks, it felt like freedom. Until the little things started happening. It began with something so minor I almost didn't notice. I came back from a late shift one night, starving, and went straight to the fridge for the leftover Chinese takeout I'd been saving. But when I opened the door, the box was gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd eaten it and just forgotten. I was exhausted, and it wouldn't have been the first time I'd blanked out on something small. But then, over the next week, more food disappeared. An unopened yogurt, half a loaf of bread, a couple of bananas. I started doubting myself, wondering if I was just scatterbrained or if maybe one of my friends had stopped by and helped themselves. Still, the thought lingered, I lived alone. Or at least I was supposed to. The weirdness didn't stop with the food. One day, I came back from class to find my bed slightly unmade. I'm not a neat freak, but I'm pretty particular about my space, and I knew for a fact I'd made it that morning. The blanket was pulled to one side, and the pillows were stacked awkwardly, like someone had been lying there. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. Maybe one of my friends had a spare key I didn't know about? I even texted a couple of them to ask, but they all swore they hadn't been near my place. It made no sense. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed, my heart racing at every little creak of the old apartment. The following week, I started noticing more unsettling changes. My toiletries were slightly out of place in the bathroom. My toothbrush was wet in the middle of the day, even though I hadn't used it since morning. A small stack of mail I'd left on the counter had been neatly rearranged, as if someone had gone through it. The worst part? My journal, a private notebook I kept hidden in my nightstand, was on the kitchen table one morning, wide open. Someone had been reading it. My stomach dropped as I flipped through the pages, my thoughts exposed for someone else to see. That was when I realized, whoever this was didn't just know I lived there. They knew me. At that point, I couldn't brush it off as coincidence or forgetfulness anymore. I spent hours trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the landlord had a key and was coming in when I wasn't home? Or worse, maybe someone had copied my key without me knowing. I called the landlord the next day, and he assured me no one else had access to my apartment. "Are you sure you're not just misplacing things?" he asked, his tone almost dismissive. I could hear the underlying doubt in his voice, like he thought I was being paranoid. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach every time I stepped inside. Then the messages started. At first, they were subtle, little notes written in my handwriting, left in places I wouldn't have put them. "Don't forget your exam," one said, taped to the fridge. I had an exam that week, but I hadn't written that note. Another said, "Buy milk," scrawled on the back of a receipt and stuck to the counter. It was unsettling, like whoever was doing this wanted me to think it was my own mind playing tricks on me. I even began doubting myself for a while, wondering if I was sleepwalking or having some sort of breakdown. But I wasn't. Deep down, I knew someone else was in my space. Things escalated quickly after that. One night, I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a faint noise coming from the bedroom. It wasn't loud, just the soft creak of a floorboard shifting under weight, but it froze me in place. My heart was pounding as I muted the TV and strained to listen. There it was again. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My first instinct was to grab something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. I ended up holding a heavy glass paperweight, my hand shaking as I tiptoed toward the bedroom door. I pushed it open, expecting to find someone, but the room was empty. Everything was in place. The only thing out of the ordinary was the faint smell of cologne lingering in the air, something I didn't own. That night I barely slept. I kept all the lights on and sat in the living room, staring at the front door, waiting for some sign of movement. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up my laptop as a makeshift security camera in the living room and another in the kitchen. I couldn't afford real cameras, but I figured it would at least capture something if someone came in while I was out. That day, I left for class like usual, my nerves on edge the entire time. When I got home, the first thing I did was check the recordings. At first, everything seemed normal, just hours of an empty apartment. But then, around 2 p.m., the footage showed something that made my blood run cold. A man's silhouette slipped out of my bedroom and walked into the kitchen. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man wasn't rushing or sneaking around. He moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He opened the fridge, took out a soda, and sat at the kitchen table like it was his own home. His face was obscured by the shadow, but I could see he was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He stayed there for at least 10 minutes, sipping the soda and flipping through something on the table, my mail. Then, as casually as he'd arrived, he disappeared back into my bedroom. My hands were trembling as I rewound the footage, trying to catch some identifying detail, but nothing about him stood out. He was maddeningly ordinary, and that made it even worse. Who the hell was he, and how long had this been going on? I called the police immediately. They sent an officer over, but by the time he arrived, the man was long gone. I showed him the footage, expecting them to take it seriously, but his reaction was underwhelming. "It's possible someone got in with an old key," he said, scratching his head. "These old buildings sometimes have issues with previous tenants holding on to them." That explanation didn't sit right with me. If this guy was just a former tenant, why was he sneaking around like that? And how did he know so much about my routine? The officer promised to file a report and recommended I change the locks, but I could tell he didn't think it was a big deal. To him, it was just another routine call. To me, it was a nightmare. I changed the locks the very next day. I also bought one of those doorstop alarms that would go off if anyone tried to open the door while I was inside. For a couple of days, things seemed normal again. No missing food, no weird noises, no notes I hadn't written. I even started convincing myself that maybe the lock change had done the trick. Maybe it really was just someone taking advantage of an old key. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I kept replaying the footage in my head, the way the man moved so confidently, like he knew the apartment, and me, so intimately. It was a kind of unease that sank into my bones and wouldn't let go. Then came the night I'll never forget. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. But then I heard it, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the carpet. My back was to the door and I was paralyzed, unable to move. The footsteps stopped right next to my bed. I could feel someone standing there, their presence heavy in the dark room. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Then, in the faint glow of the street light filtering through the blinds, I saw a shadow stretch across the wall. Someone was leaning over me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every instinct in me screamed to move, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity, and then I heard it, a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You shouldn't have changed the locks." My blood ran ice cold. The voice was low, calm, and terrifyingly familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. As suddenly as it had come, the shadow retreated. The footsteps shuffled back toward the door, and the room fell silent. I stayed frozen for several minutes, too afraid to turn around. When I finally did, the door was ajar, and the faint smell of that same cologne hung in the air. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I grabbed my laptop and played back the footage from the living room camera. My heart sank when I saw it. Around 2 a.m., the man emerged from the hallway closet. The closet I never used, the one I thought was empty. He was carrying a small duffel bag, which he set on the couch as he casually flipped through my belongings. Then, at 3 a.m., he disappeared into my bedroom. The footage cut off shortly after that, as if he'd noticed the camera and turned it off. My stomach churned. He'd been living in the closet. He'd been there all along. I didn't waste another second. I packed a bag with whatever I could grab and bolted out of the apartment. I called the police again, practically screaming into the phone, and they promised to send someone right away. I sat in my car parked down the block, watching the building like it might swallow me whole. When the officers arrived, I showed them the footage and told them about the closet. They entered the apartment with their guns drawn while I waited outside, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. It felt like hours before they came back out, but when they did, the look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They found the closet stuffed with personal items, clothes, toiletries, a notebook filled with what looked like journal entries. The officer in charge asked if I wanted to see it, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. He flipped through it for me and his expression darkened. The notebook wasn't just random notes, it was about me. My daily routines, conversations I'd had, even things I'd written in my own journal. He knew everything, my schedule, my favorite foods, the name of the professor I hated. There was no sign of the man, though. He disappeared before the police arrived, leaving behind his eerie collection of observations and that lingering sense of violation. The police assured me they would file a full report and keep an eye out for the man, but it felt like a hollow promise. I asked them how someone could have been living in my apartment for weeks, maybe even months, without me noticing. One of the officers explained that some older buildings had crawl spaces or shared ventilation systems that could connect units, making it easier for someone to sneak in and out unnoticed. They didn't find any clear evidence of how he'd been getting in, though, which only made the whole thing feel even more surreal. I was left with more questions than answers. Who was he? How long had he been watching me? And what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night? I never went back to the apartment. The landlord was surprisingly understanding when I called to break the lease, though I didn't tell him the full story. I moved into a new place, a studio with no closets and only one door, and for a while I couldn't sleep without checking every inch of it twice. I kept the footage from my old apartment on an external drive just in case, but I've never been able to bring myself to watch it again. Sometimes I still think about that whisper in the dark. You shouldn't have changed the locks. It wasn't just a threat. It felt personal, like he thought the apartment was his, and I was the intruder. Even now, years later, I can't fully shake the paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every misplaced object, sends me spiraling back to that apartment. I've tried to move on, to tell myself it was just a random encounter with a disturbed person, but there's a part of me that doesn't believe that. He knew too much, more than anyone could have, just by sneaking in and out. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching from a distance, waiting for me to let my guard down. It's irrational, I know, but after what happened, I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. I've shared this story a few times, usually with people who laugh it off or tell me I'm brave for handling it as well as I did. Brave? I don't feel brave. I feel lucky. Lucky that I woke up that night, lucky that I wasn't hurt, lucky that he didn't decide to escalate things further. Whoever he was more than a stranger in my home. He was a ghost of sorts, slipping in and out of my life, leaving behind nothing but questions and the kind of fear that settles deep into your bones. I don't know if I'll ever get answers, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes, it's easier to live with the unknown than to confront the full truth of what might have been. Story 3. The missing keys. I've always been the kind of person who likes order and chaos, at least with the small things. My house keys, for instance, have always had a designated spot. The little ceramic dish on the entryway table, right next to the potted cactus I inherited from my grandmother. I don't know why, but I get a sense of comfort from that routine. It's like an unspoken rule of my life. Keys go in the dish, shoes by the door, everything in its place. So, you can imagine my confusion the first time I couldn't find my keys. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn, just after work. I dropped my purse on the floor and reached for the dish, only to find it empty. At first, I thought I'd just forgotten to put them there in the morning. Maybe I was distracted. But after scouring every corner of my house and even retracing my steps from the day, they were nowhere to be found. I ended up finding them stuffed in the side pocket of my coat, which didn't make sense. I never put them there. The second time it happened, I felt the tiniest pang of paranoia. It was 2 weeks later, another gray Tuesday, and once again my keys weren't in the dish when I got home. This time, I found them on the kitchen counter near the sink, next to a half-empty glass of water I didn't remember pouring. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just forgetfulness. I knew my habits, and I knew they weren't prone to breaking like this. I even called my best friend, Sarah, that night, trying to laugh it off as one of those weird coincidences. She joked that maybe I had a mischievous ghost or a sneaky roommate I didn't know about, but we both knew I lived alone. Still, I brushed it off, thinking it was just stress or sleep deprivation messing with me. That is, until the footprints showed up. The footprints were faint, almost like smudges of dust on the wooden floor near the front door. At first, I thought I'd tracked them in myself, maybe from the damp weather outside, but the shape was wrong. They weren't shoe prints. They looked like bare feet, small enough that they could have belonged to a child or a petite adult. The weird thing was that they didn't go anywhere. They just lingered around the door, almost like whoever left them had been standing there, waiting. I crouched down, running my fingers over the marks. They weren't damp or muddy. It was as if they had been pressed into the wood itself, just faint enough to almost blend in. That night, I swept the area clean and tried not to think about it. I even convinced myself that maybe I'd somehow overlooked them before. But deep down, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise every time I walked past that spot. Then came the night I heard the sound. It was around midnight and I'd been struggling to fall asleep. My room was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside, its light spilling through the edges of the blinds. I was lying in bed, eyes closed, when I heard it, a soft click like the sound of a door unlocking. My heart froze. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but the house fell silent. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but then I remembered the missing keys. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet barely brushing the carpet, and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a glass paperweight from my nightstand. Slowly I crept toward the door, every creak of the floorboards making me wince. When I peeked into the hallway, there was nothing. No sign of anyone. I double-checked the locks, all of them secure, and told myself I must have dreamed the sound. But it didn't feel like a dream. The next morning, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I checked the locks on the front door again before leaving for work, jiggling them more than once to be sure they were secure. The keys were safely in the ceramic dish where I'd left them, so I pushed the whole thing out of my mind, convincing myself it was just paranoia. But when I got home that evening, the keys were gone. My heart sank and my stomach twisted into knots. I tore through the house, searching in every possible spot, but they were nowhere to be found. Then I noticed it. The faint footprints were back, just like before, hovering around the front door. This time, though, they were slightly more defined, like someone had stepped closer to the center of the room. The worst part? My ceramic dish had been moved. It wasn't much, just an inch or two, but I knew it had been placed deliberately. I stood there frozen, clutching my purse like it was some kind of shield, the silence in the house pressing in around me. That night I couldn't sleep. I locked my bedroom door, wedging a chair under the handle like I'd seen in movies. I kept my phone close, its screen lighting up the dark room every time I checked the time. At around 3 a.m. I heard it again, that same soft, deliberate click. My blood ran cold, but this time there was no mistaking it. Someone was unlocking my front door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever it was would hear it. I held my breath, straining to catch any other sounds. The door creaked open ever so slightly. I could feel it in my chest as much as I could hear it. For a moment, everything was still. Then came the softest shuffle, like bare feet brushing against the floorboards. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, locked tight with fear. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in my bed, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The footsteps were slow, unhurried, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. I could see the faint shadow of movement beneath the gap, and I swear I heard the softest exhale, like someone was standing there listening. My chest was so tight it hurt. I wanted to call the police, but the thought of making a sound, even just a whisper, felt like it would break whatever fragile thread of safety was keeping me alive. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps retreated. I stayed up the rest of the night, waiting for the first light of dawn before I dared to open the door. The house was empty, or at least it seemed that way, but the front door was slightly ajar, the lock turned neatly to the side. The next day I took action. I went to the hardware store after work and bought new locks, the kind with codes instead of keys. I even picked up a doorbell camera, telling myself that once I had these things in place, I'd feel safe again. That evening, as I was installing everything, I found something that made my stomach drop. My old keys. They were sitting on the floor just inside the front door, like someone had carefully placed them there. They hadn't been there when I left for work. I was sure of it. It was as if whoever had taken them was taunting me, letting me know they could come and go as they pleased. I finished installing the locks with shaking hands, constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd turn around and find someone watching me. By the time everything was secure, it was past midnight, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I might actually get some sleep. That sense of safety didn't last long. The next evening, I checked the doorbell camera footage out of habit before heading to bed. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the flickering of the porch light and the occasional car passing in the distance. But then, around 2 a.m., the motion detector caught something. My stomach flipped as I hit play. The footage showed a figure standing just out of the camera's direct view, their outline barely visible in the shadows. They didn't approach the door or try to get closer. They just stood there, motionless, watching. My hands started to tremble as I scrubbed through the video, hoping to see them leave, but they didn't. The footage cut off after a few minutes with the figure still there, as if the camera had given up trying to record whatever they were doing. I couldn't sleep after that. I left all the lights in the house on and kept a kitchen knife by my bed, the glow of the doorbell camera app lighting up my phone every few minutes as I refreshed it obsessively. The next day, I called Sarah and told her everything. At first, she tried to rationalize it, suggesting it was maybe a neighbor or a prank, but I could hear the unease in her voice. She offered to come stay with me for a few nights, and I agreed without hesitation. When she arrived, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like having someone else there would finally make it stop. That night, we double-checked all the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and even dragged the couch in front of the door for good measure. We stayed up late, sipping wine and joking nervously about how I'd probably been watching too many horror movies. It was almost enough to make me believe it myself. But around 3 a.m., the doorbell camera went off again. Sarah and I froze, exchanging a look that sent a chill through my entire body. I opened the app, and there it was. The figure, closer this time, standing directly under the porch light. Sarah leaned over my shoulder as we stared at the screen. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a statue. The porch light illuminated enough to show their outline, slim, with shoulders slightly hunched forward, as if they were leaning in to listen for something. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to form words. My finger hovered over the phone screen, ready to call the police, but then the figure did something that made my blood run cold. They tilted their head, slowly, unnaturally, almost like they were trying to peer directly into the camera. Even though the lens didn't capture their face, I felt like they were staring right at me. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Call someone," she hissed, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked out of frame, their bare feet making no sound on the porch. We stayed awake the rest of the night, jumping at every creak and shadow. By the time the sun rose, I was a wreck, and Sarah didn't look much better. She convinced me to report the incident, so I went to the police station that morning with the footage. The officer at the desk listened politely, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. "It's probably just a prank," he said, handing me back my phone. "Teenagers messing around. Happens all the time." I wanted to scream. This wasn't a prank. This was deliberate. Personal. The officer promised to send someone to patrol the area, but his tone made it clear he didn't expect anything to come of it. I left the station feeling more alone than ever. That evening, Sarah had to go home, promising she'd check in with me later. As I watched her drive away, a deep, sinking feeling settled in my chest. I wasn't sure I'd make it through another night alone. That night, I tried to convince myself the police were right, that it was just some neighborhood kid pulling a cruel joke. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I triple-checked the locks, made sure the new security system was armed, and even pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom door. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every little sound the house made. Around 1:30 a.m., the doorbell camera app sent a notification to my phone. My hands were clammy as I reached for it, the weight of dread pressing down on me. I tapped the notification and my heart stopped. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot as before. This time they were holding something small and glinting in the porch light. My keys. The ones I'd replaced weeks ago. I could barely breathe as I watched them dangle the keys, swaying them slowly, deliberately, as if mocking me. I wanted to call the police, but my fingers felt numb, unable to unlock the phone screen. The figure tilted their head again, the same unnerving motion from the night before, and then they did something I'll never forget. They raised their free hand and pointed directly at the camera. No, at me. I don't know how I knew, but I felt it in my bones. They weren't just pointing at the lens, they knew I was watching. My chest tightened as I forced myself to call 911, my voice shaking as I whispered the situation to the operator. She tried to keep me calm, telling me officers were on their way, but the figure didn't wait. They simply turned and walked off into the night, leaving the keys on the porch steps. When the police arrived, they found no one. The officers looked around, checked the footage, and even searched the neighborhood, but it was as if the person had vanished into thin air. After the police left, I stood on the porch, staring at the keys they'd left behind. They were unmistakably mine. The little brass one with the scratch by the bow, the silver one with a tiny dent near the tip. I didn't pick them up. I couldn't. It felt like some kind of trap, like touching them would somehow pull me deeper into whatever was happening. Instead, I left them there, glinting in the faint light of the porch. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch with every light in the house on, clutching a baseball bat I'd found in the closet. Every creak, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept checking the doorbell camera app, waiting for another notification, but nothing came. The silence felt worse than the noise, heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The next day, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house replaced, even the ones I'd just installed. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't matter, that locks and cameras wouldn't stop whoever, or whatever, it was. I even started looking up apartments, thinking maybe I should just leave. But the thought of abandoning my home, the place I'd worked so hard to make my own, made me sick to my stomach. By evening, I had talked myself into staying, convincing myself it was all over. Maybe they'd gotten bored. Maybe they wouldn't come back. But when I went to take the trash out, I found a note taped to the inside of my front door. It was a scrap of lined paper, the edges torn and jagged, with a single sentence written in shaky black ink. "You shouldn't have changed the locks." My hands started trembling so badly I almost dropped the paper. They had been inside the house. Again. That note broke something inside me. This wasn't my home anymore, it was theirs, whoever they were. I packed a bag that night, throwing in whatever I could carry, and called Sarah. I begged her to let me crash at her place for a while, and she didn't hesitate to say yes. Before I left, I did one last sweep of the house, more out of instinct than any real purpose. That's when I noticed something else, the footprints. They were back, leading from the front door into the living room and stopping right in front of the couch where I had sat the night before. The thought of them standing there, watching me while I clutched that bat and stared at the shadows, made my stomach churn. I didn't bother cleaning up or locking the door behind me. I just grabbed my bag, jumped into my car, and drove straight to Sarah's, praying I'd never have to set foot in that house again. It's been 6 months now and I haven't gone back. I broke my lease, left most of my belongings behind, and moved to a different city. Sarah tried to convince me to see a therapist, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about it with anyone. Even now, the thought of those keys, those footprints, makes my skin crawl. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, and maybe that's the worst part. Whoever they were, they never followed me to my new place. At least, I don't think they did. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in my new apartment, I'll catch myself glancing at the front door, half expecting to see a faint footprint or hear the soft click of a lock turning. And every time I leave my keys in their new designated spot, I can't help but wonder if I'll find them somewhere else the next time I come home. Story 4. The Open Window. I don't know where to start, really. My name is Jack, and I moved into this old two-story house with my daughter, Emily, about 6 months ago. She's 7 with a wild imagination and an unshakable fear of monsters under the bed. Typical kid stuff. I'm a single dad, juggling a 9-to-5 IT job and parenthood, so when we found this place for a steal, I didn't think twice. Sure, it was a bit run down, but it had charm. Emily loved her new room, especially the bay window that overlooked the backyard. I even built her a little reading nook there, complete with pillows and fairy lights. Life was starting to feel stable again. Or so I thought. The first time it happened, I blamed myself. I remember locking all the windows before bed, a nightly routine since Emily was terrified of anything that went bump in the night. But when I went to wake her up for school the next morning, her window was wide open. The curtains were billowing in the early spring breeze, and her favorite stuffed animal, a beat-up bunny named Mr. Whiskers, was on the floor beneath the sill. I frowned but chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I'd just forgotten to latch it properly. Still, it gnawed at me. I didn't want her catching a cold, so I triple-checked every window before going to bed that night. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The second time it happened, I was sure I hadn't made a mistake. It was about a week later. I had latched the window, pushed on it to make sure it was secure, and even drawn the curtains before heading to bed. Yet, when I went to check on Emily in the morning, the window was wide open again. This time, the reading nook pillows were scattered across the floor as if someone, or something, had thrown them. Emily was still asleep, bundled tightly under her blankets, completely unaware. I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the window. Could it have been the wind? But no, there hadn't been a storm or strong gusts that night. I started questioning my memory, second-guessing myself at every turn. Things escalated from there. Over the next few weeks, the same thing kept happening. No matter how securely I locked that window, I'd wake up to find it open. Sometimes it was just the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. Other times, Emily's belongings were disturbed, books toppled over, her drawings scattered. I even bought a new latch for the window, one that required extra force to unlock. But that didn't stop it. By then, I was losing sleep. I'd lie awake at night, listening for any sound, any hint that someone, or something, was tampering with the window. I started waking up at odd hours, drenched in sweat, my ears straining for noises that never came. One night, I decided to stay up and catch whoever, or whatever, was behind this. I set up an old camping chair in Emily's room after she fell asleep, tucking her in and promising her everything was fine. I left the light off and sat in the corner, my phone in hand, ready to call the cops if I needed to. Hours passed, and the house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Around 2 a.m., I started to nod off despite my best efforts to stay awake. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails against glass. My heart jumped into my throat as I turned toward the window, barely able to make out the outline of the latch slowly moving on its own. I froze, unsure of what to do. The latch clicked open with a soft metallic sound, and the window began to slide upward. The curtains fluttered as the cool night air poured into the room. I felt rooted to the spot, every hair on my body standing on end. There was no one there, at least no one I could see. I bolted toward the window and slammed it shut, locking it again with trembling hands. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible but didn't wake up. I stayed up the rest of the night, my back pressed against her bedroom door, gripping a baseball bat I kept for emergencies. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't normal. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I decided to do some digging. The house was old, built in the 1940s, and had been through several owners before me. I managed to track down a local historian who specialized in the area, hoping she could tell me more about the property's history. When I mentioned the address, her face darkened, and she asked if I'd ever heard of the Milner family. I hadn't. She told me that in the 1970s, a family of 4 had lived in the house: a father, a mother, and their 2 children. One night, the youngest child, a girl named Clara, had disappeared. Her bedroom window was found open, but no trace of her was ever discovered. The case went cold and the family moved away shortly after. Hearing that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop picturing Emily's window, wide open in the dead of night. I asked the historian if there were any other strange occurrences linked to the house, but she just shrugged and said, if walls could talk, that place would probably scream. That night, I couldn't bring myself to tell Emily. How do you explain something like that to a 7-year-old? Instead, I doubled down on security, installing motion sensors and even putting a camera in her room, something I swore I'd never do because it felt like an invasion of privacy. But this was different. I needed answers, and I was willing to do whatever it took to protect my daughter. The first night with the camera set up, I barely slept. I kept checking the live feed on my phone, watching Emily as she tossed and turned in her sleep. The window stayed shut, and for the first time in weeks, I started to feel a sliver of hope that maybe the extra precautions had worked. But when I reviewed the footage the next morning, that hope shattered. Around 2:17 a.m., the video showed the latch on the window slowly sliding open again. But this time there was more. A faint, shadowy figure, a child-sized silhouette, appeared briefly near the window. It wasn't clear, the image was grainy, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The figure seemed to pause, almost as if it was looking at Emily, before disappearing as suddenly as it had come. I didn't know what to think. A ghost? An intruder? My mind raced through every possibility, none of them comforting. I showed the footage to a friend of mine, Greg, who's a cop, hoping for some logical explanation. He studied it for a long time before shaking his head and saying, I don't know what to tell you, Jack. There's no sign of forced entry, and that thing doesn't look human. His words hung in the air like a curse. He offered to swing by at night to keep an eye on the place, but I could tell even he didn't feel good about it. That evening, I sat Emily down and gently asked her if she'd ever seen anything strange in her room. She hesitated, then said, Sometimes I see a little girl by the window. She looks sad. My stomach dropped. Emily's words rattled around in my head for the rest of the day. A little girl by the window? Sad. I felt like I was unraveling. That night, I stayed awake in her room again, this time with the lights on and my phone ready to record. I kept asking myself what I'd do if I saw the figure again. Run, scream, fight? When the clock ticked past 2 a.m., my nerves were shot. Then it happened. The window latch moved, slower than ever, and the glass creaked as it slid open. My breath caught in my throat as the same shadowy figure appeared. It wasn't just a silhouette anymore. It was clearer now, a girl, maybe 7 or 8, with hollow eyes and hair that moved as if underwater. She stood at the edge of the window, staring at Emily, who was sound asleep. I wanted to move, to yell, but I was frozen. The girl turned to look at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a deep, suffocating silence. I forced myself to my feet, heart pounding, and slammed the window shut. The figure vanished the moment the latch clicked into place and the room went still. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up Emily and drove to my sister's place 2 towns over. I couldn't stay in that house another second. Over the next week, I hired a professional to investigate the history of the property. What he found confirmed my worst fears. Clara Milner's body had been discovered years after her disappearance, buried beneath the floorboards of what was now Emily's room. I sold the house within the month, leaving behind the memories and whatever else was still lingering there. To this day, I never told Emily the full story. She still asks why we left, and I just tell her it wasn't safe. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe again. Story 5. The Unseen Watcher. When this happened, I was 27 and had just moved into a small rental house with my fiancé, Jake. It was early spring and the air still carried that crisp, cool bite. The house wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place tucked near the edge of a dense forest in upstate New York. We were trying to save up for a bigger place, and this felt like the perfect temporary escape from the chaos of the city. At first, Everything felt idyllic. The mornings were quiet except for birdsong, and at night the stars looked close enough to touch. We spent our evenings unpacking, sharing cheap wine, and laughing about the little quirks of the house. The creaky floorboards, the ancient fridge that hummed like it was alive. Life was simple, peaceful. At least that's how it started. The first time we noticed the footprints, we didn't think much of it. They appeared in the dirt just outside the back door, near the edge of the woods. Jake spotted them first and called me over. "Hey, come look at this," he said, crouching near the prints. They weren't huge, just a little larger than a child's foot, but they were oddly shaped, almost as if the toes were spread out wider than normal. "Must be a stray dog," Jake concluded, brushing it off. I agreed. What else could it be? But something about them made me uneasy. The tracks didn't trail off into the woods like you'd expect. Instead, they stopped abruptly a few feet from our door, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. I remember shivering, though it wasn't cold, and quickly changing the subject. A week passed without incident, and I almost forgot about the footprints, until Jake found them again. This time they weren't near the back door. They were by the bedroom window, pressed into a patch of soft dirt under the sill. The weird part? The prints seemed to face the house directly, like someone, or something, had been standing there watching. Jake laughed it off, saying, "Probably just a raccoon or something curious," but I wasn't so sure. These prints were deeper, more deliberate, and again they ended abruptly, as if whatever left them had disappeared into thin air. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Even with all the windows locked, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there. Things took a strange turn about 2 days later. As I was heading out to grab the mail, I noticed something shiny near the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash, but as I got closer, I saw it was a silver charm bracelet. It looked old, the kind of thing someone might have worn years ago. I picked it up and showed it to Jake when I got back inside. "Did you drop this?" I asked, but he shook his head. "No. Maybe someone left it here before we moved in?" That didn't feel right, though. It looked freshly placed, as if it had been left there intentionally. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that whoever, or whatever, had left those footprints wanted us to know they were close. Too close. The next few nights were tense. I started waking up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something outside. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, the faint sound of movement just beyond the tree line. Jake assured me it was just animals, but I could tell he was starting to feel uneasy too. One morning, as we were drinking coffee on the porch, I noticed something else. There were more footprints, only this time they were circling the house. They weren't deep, but they were distinct, and they looked fresher than before. Jake muttered a curse under his breath and grabbed a stick, poking at the tracks like he could will them to make sense. "This is getting weird," he admitted. "Maybe it's time to call someone." But who do you call for something like this? We decided to wait it out, hoping it was just a prank or a harmless animal passing through. The final straw came a few days later. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I spotted it. A small, neatly folded piece of paper stuck under a rock in the middle of the yard. My heart dropped. I hesitated for a moment, staring out the window, half expecting someone to come sprinting out of the woods. But nothing happened. The yard was still eerily quiet. I called Jake, and together we went out to retrieve it. The paper was old and yellowed, with what looked like scribbled symbols on it. Nothing I could make sense of. There was something else too. A lock of blonde hair, tied with a thin piece of twine, tucked under the rock alongside the note. I felt sick. Jake's face turned pale, and for the first time he didn't try to laugh it off. "This isn't a joke," he said, his voice low. "Someone's been here, watching us." That night we decided to stay up and keep watch. Jake set up a chair by the front window with a clear view of the yard, while I sat near the back door, clutching a flashlight. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made my heart race. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind, coming from the woods. I froze, holding my breath, straining to make out the sound. It wasn't clear enough to understand, but it sent chills down my spine. I tiptoed to Jake, whispering what I'd heard. He nodded, his face tight with tension. "I swear I saw something move out there," he said, pointing toward the tree line. But when we both looked, there was nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. Still, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning we found another item. This time it was a Polaroid photo stuck in the same spot as the folded paper from before. It showed the back of our house, taken from deep within the woods. The picture wasn't clear, but you could make out the outline of the kitchen window, and me standing there washing dishes. My stomach dropped as I realized it had been taken the same day we found the lock of hair. Jake stared at the photo in disbelief. "This isn't just someone messing around. They've been close. Right here." His voice was shaking, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. We agreed we couldn't stay quiet anymore. Jake called the police that afternoon, explaining everything that had happened. But when they came to check things out, the footprints had been washed away by the rain, and they didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just kids playing a prank," the officer said. But I knew better. Whoever was out there wasn't just playing. That evening, after the police left, the uneasiness in the house was unbearable. Every shadow felt alive, every sound magnified tenfold. Jake suggested we stay at a motel for the night, but I refused. A part of me was scared that if we left, whoever was doing this might take it as an invitation to get even closer, or worse, get inside. We decided to lock ourselves in, double-checking every window and door. Jake stayed by the front door with a bat while I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but my mind kept circling back to that Polaroid. How long had they been watching? How many other times had they been close without us noticing? The thought made my skin crawl. Around midnight, there was a sudden loud thud against the side of the house. We both jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake grabbed the bat and motioned for me to stay put. I didn't argue. He moved cautiously to the front window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. "I don't see anything," he whispered, though his voice was tight with fear. I joined him, peering out into the dark yard. That's when we saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the faint glow of the porch light. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. I couldn't make out any features, but the way they stood, so still and deliberate, sent a wave of dread through me. Jake flung open the door and shouted, "Hey, who's there?" But the figure didn't react. Instead, it turned slowly and disappeared into the trees. Jake started to run after it, but I grabbed his arm, pleading with him to stay. "What if it's a trap?" I begged. Reluctantly, he stayed, slamming the door shut and locking it again. We sat together in silence, both too terrified to sleep. The next morning, the tension was suffocating. Neither of us had slept, and we both jumped at every small noise. As Jake went outside to check the yard, I stayed by the window watching him. He froze suddenly and called out, "You need to see this." My stomach churned as I stepped outside. Near the edge of the woods, where the figure had stood the night before, there was a small pile of items that belonged to us. My missing scarf from weeks ago, a sock I hadn't seen since we moved in, and even Jake's old baseball cap he thought he'd lost in the move. They were arranged neatly, like an offering or some twisted message. "They've been inside," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. It was the only explanation. Whoever had been watching us wasn't just out in the woods. They'd breached the one place we thought we were safe. That was it. We packed our bags and left that afternoon, not even bothering to clean up the house. We didn't feel safe there, not even for another night. Jake insisted we stay with friends until we could figure out our next steps. A few days later, the landlord called, furious that we had abandoned the property. I explained everything, but he brushed it off, claiming no one else had ever reported anything strange. "Probably just your imagination," he said dismissively. "But I know what we saw, what we felt. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched." Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I hear whispers outside the window. Jake says it's just the trauma playing tricks on me, but I'm not so sure. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't just watching us. They wanted us to know they could reach us anytime they wanted. We never went back, and I don't think I'll ever live near the woods again.